Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're stepping back in time, not to glorify battles, but to uncover a truth often buried beneath the armor and glory, the real, everyday cost of war in the Middle Ages. Forget the romanticized tales. We're talking about the crushing burdens felt by ordinary people. Imagine living in a world where war wasn't just a distant rumor, but a looming shadow over your village, your workshop, your ledger, and even your spiritual life. For roughly 10 minutes, we were going to follow four very different people through a single brutal campaign season: a peasant, a craftsman, a merchant, and a cleric, and see how the demands of war reshaped their entire existence. Get ready for a fascinating and often somber journey. Let's start with Ilara, a peasant woman tilling her small plot of land. For Ilara and her family, life was already a relentless cycle of hard labor. They lived hand to mouth, their survival entirely dependent on the harvest. Then, word arrived. The local lord was raising an army. What did this mean for Ilara? First, higher taxes. The lord needed money for weapons, armor, and supplies. So a larger portion of her meager harvest, perhaps her precious few eggs or even a lamb, would be demanded, leaving her family with even less to eat through the lean winter months. But it wasn't just taxes. The lord's men would often requisition resources directly. Ilara might see her best livestock taken for the army's provisions, or her carefully stored grain carted away. It was an arbitrary seizure, often with little to no compensation, leaving her with the impossible task of feeding her children with an empty larder. And then came the conscription. While often not directly fighting, peasant men were frequently forced into service as laborers, digging trenches, building fortifications, or hauling supplies for weeks, even months. This meant fewer hands in the fields, directly impacting the harvest and threatening the family's survival. Ilara's husband, or even her older sons, could be called away, leaving her and the younger children to manage the farm alone, a near impossible feat. A bad harvest meant starvation, and war made a bad harvest almost inevitable for many. The fear of raiding armies, too, was constant. Even if her own lord's army was victorious, enemy forces might sweep through, burning fields, looting homes, and disrupting the very fabric of their simple lives. The cost for Ilara wasn't just money or food. It was the gnawing anxiety, the forced labor, the threat of starvation, and the constant disruption to the rhythm of life itself. Her existence, already fragile, became even more precarious under the shadow of war. Next, we meet Thomas, the diligent craftsman. Thomas ran a bustling workshop in a small town, specializing in metalwork, perhaps blacksmithing or armor repair. When war broke out, Thomas might initially see a boom in business. Lords and knights would need new swords, repaired armor, and fresh arrowheads. This sounds good, right? More orders, more money. However, the reality was far more complex. The sudden demand could overwhelm his small operation. He'd need more raw materials, iron, charcoal, which might become scarce or more expensive as supply lines were disrupted or prioritized for the army. His skilled apprentices or even journeymen might be conscripted, leaving him short-handed. Even if he could meet the demand, payment wasn't always guaranteed or immediate. Lords were notorious for paying slowly or in kind or sometimes not at all, especially if their campaign didn't go as planned. Thomas might be forced to extend credit, tying up his capital and leaving his own family vulnerable if the payment never materialized. The increased workload, the stress of uncertain payment, and the constant threat of his own conscription or the disruption of trade routes for his materials created an immense strain. His craftsmanship, a source of pride and livelihood, became a tool for war, often at significant personal cost. His business might boom for a time, but the boom was built on sand, liable to collapse with the next battle or unpaid invoice. The war changed Thomas's trade from one of steady, purposeful creation to one dictated by the bloody demands of conflict. Now let's turn our attention to Agnes, a savvy merchant operating out of a thriving town. Agnes made her living by moving goods, cloth, spices, wine, tools, across regions, her success dependent on stable roads and safe trade routes. For Agnes, war was often an unmitigated disaster. The very first thing she'd notice was disruption to her supply chains. Roads that were once safe might become dangerous, patrolled by roving soldiers, bandits, or even enemy scouts. This meant higher risks, longer journeys, and increased costs for guards. Tolls, too, would likely increase. Local lords, desperate for funds, would levy new taxes on goods passing through their territory. This ate into Agnes's profits and drove up prices for consumers. Some trade routes might become entirely impassable, cutting off access to vital markets or sources of goods. Her carefully built network of contacts could be fractured overnight. Furthermore, the broader economy would suffer. With peasants conscripted and harvests uncertain, there were fewer people to buy her goods. With craftsmen struggling, there were fewer quality items to sell. The entire economic ecosystem that Agnes relied on would destabilize. Her ships or wagons might be requisitioned for military transport, her goods seized. For Agnes, war meant plummeting profits, increased risks, and a constant struggle to adapt to an ever-changing and dangerous commercial landscape. Her entire livelihood, based on peace and free movement, was undermined at every turn. War didn't just cost money, it cost the very flow of commerce, the lifeblood of towns. Finally, we consider Father Michael, a humble cleric serving his village church. While not directly involved in combat, the church played a critical and often complicated role during wartime. For Father Michael, the impacts were multifaceted. First, there were the church's own obligations. The church, being a powerful landholder, often had to contribute financially to the war effort or provide supplies and even men, though typically not fighting clerics. This meant the tithes collected from the villagers, already struggling, would be stretched thinner. Father Michael might be asked to encourage his parishioners to contribute more, putting him in a difficult position between the demands of his superiors and the hardship of his flock. Then there was the human cost he witnessed daily. He became the confessor for men going off to war, the consoler for grieving widows and orphans, the spiritual guide for a community gripped by fear and uncertainty. His days would be filled with funerals, prayers for the fallen, and attempts to offer comfort in the face of despair. Morale would plummet, and Father Michael would be tasked with maintaining hope and faith amidst destruction. Furthermore, churches themselves were not always spared. Armies, both friendly and enemy, might requisition church property for lodging or supplies, or even loot sacred treasures for their own enrichment. Father Michael's role shifted from purely spiritual guidance to one of community leader, caregiver, and sometimes even protector of what little stability remained. His greatest challenge was to offer spiritual solace when the world around him seemed to be crumbling, and to explain why such suffering was allowed. So, as you can see, war in the Middle Ages wasn't just about kings and knights clashing on a battlefield. It was a grinding, pervasive burden that touched every aspect of life for Ilara the peasant, Thomas the craftsman, Agnes the merchant, and Father Michael the cleric. Taxes, conscription, requisitioning, disrupted trade, emotional distress, and spiritual crises. These were the real costs, paid not just in gold, but in sweat, tears, and shattered lives. The romantic ideals of chivalry often obscured the profound suffering endured by the vast majority of people caught in the machinery of conflict. Understanding these forgotten stories helps us appreciate the true gravity of war, regardless of the era. If you found this deep dive into medieval life illuminating, please hit that like button. What aspect of medieval life surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more history delivered straight to your feed, be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure into the past. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.